Hello! The question this time is about the future of movies. So I want to talk about what I see as the future of moving images. First of all, when people think about movies, we think about these big blockbusters, very expensive, what I would call charismatic movies that take millions of dollars to make, that appeal to many, many people, that may take up to 1 million hours of labor to make some of the biggest movies. And they sort of feature in our minds when we think about the word movies. But I have to remind ourselves at this very beginning of the conversation that most of the moving images that we're going to look at and see in our lives are not big blockbuster movies, but in fact, moving images on YouTube or TikTok or in Facebook, they're much smaller, they're much more local, they're much cheaper, much more expensive, much more common. And it's these latter that actually may be the future of movies, the big blockbusters that we see. Those charismatic movies are never going to go away. They're kind of like handcrafted in many ways. And they're going to continue, but there'll be more and more of the other type, maybe even intermediary level moving images that are not as expensive and not as big budget, but maybe they're more expensive than making a YouTube. And in between, even they will fill out and become more common in respect to the few charismatic big budget movies that we think of in our own heads. So, one of the changes that we're going to see in this landscape of moving images is duration. A lot of TV programs were made with a slot of a half an hour in mind, give or take some commercial time in between, or maybe an hour. And then a lot of the short stuff that we see is 4 or 5 minutes long, which is sort of our attention span. But what we're going to be seeing is the increase in the variety of the different lengths of the material. Some of the larger series that often play on cable TV are basically a narrative that's 100 hours long. It's like basically they're 100-hour plus movies. The series Lost, The Wire, Game of Thrones are structured like a 100-hour movie. And I think we haven't seen how long they become. I think they're going to become even longer than that. I think we're going to, in the next decade or two, have 200-hour movies that last maybe hundreds of hours in duration, that are actually crafted from the beginning to have a narrative arc that will last 200 hours to tell the whole story, or 300 hours. So I think we're going to see some very, very long ones, more long ones, because now that it's possible, we know that there's a market. There won't be that many, but there will be some. And then we're also going to evolve and create intermediate ones that maybe only last 20 hours, some that will last shorter and shorter. That's another pattern that we see, is how short can these stories become. And in TikTok and places like that, we see them happening in the matter of seconds. And right now they're kind of trivial and they're very much meme-based, but we can also tell a story in a very short time. Witness the 30-second commercial. So I think we're going to see some blend of what we see in commercials moved to just a storytelling element, where you try to tell a story in 90 seconds, minute and a half, or 4 minutes. And we'll see more of these and more deliberate construction of those kinds of movies. A second, besides just the duration, I think a second thing that we're going to see in this world is more world building. The world of science fiction and fantasy sort of pioneered this, but it's starting to happen more and more. Just in a non-science fiction arena, where we actually create a world. We manufactured a world. And In the past, that world would have been required to be made physically. Hammers and nails, plywood, construction materials. But now with the digital, we have the ability to make up worlds very, very fast and to even recycle certain aspects of them and incorporate and modify them. Well, we can make entire cities, artificial cities, virtual cities, in which the characters can act in. And in the past, that would have been prohibitively expensive to do. But now we can make virtual sets that, again, are economical and, more importantly, allow us a level of creativity that we couldn't have before. So the idea of having virtual sets, for a while, that was a more expensive thing to do than have a physical set. But now that's becoming, and will become flipped in the future, where the physical will become the more expensive, and to have a virtual set will become the economical. And the virtual, again, allows us far more degrees of freedom in our imagination. Inside this world that we're building, and again, you can imagine it being not just some futuristic city in another galaxy, but also could just be the past. It could be a city on Earth in the past, even 20 years ago. And again, it can be easier to modify the existing files that we have and make a world of the 1960s digitally cheaper than it would be to try to find a place like that or even to modify it. So that world building and being able to have a digital double is a huge part of these blockbuster films. And I think eventually the price will come down, that it'll be an asset that anybody can actually use, where you can basically purchase or buy in New York City from the 1920s. If you want to make a film or even a skit, you just buy that New York City, and you can have a fully fledged New York City populated with people who are walking around, and that is your set. And you can kind of twist the dial and get whatever year you want, 1920, and there you have it. And so then you can actually act within that, shoot a film in the ways that you would film in a regular space, using technologies like virtual reality, like goggles. You can put the actors and the director in that same virtual scene, that virtual set, and you can have something that would have been in the past millions and millions of dollars to construct. Not only can we have sets that are digital doubles, we can also have extras that are digital doubles. So people who are walking around who don't say anything, and they can just be created out of whole cloth, and they can look amazingly exactly like a human would at that distance. We can do that now. And so it's easy to populate this with extras that are also not living beings, but they're actually recreations. In some cases, they're completely synthetic. They're not based on any real person at all. They're just a completely synthetic face. We can also do things where we can take a real actor and we can replace them in certain scenes with a digital double, like a stunt double, where they're doing something that maybe they can't do or don't want to do. And we won't be able to tell the difference. And we can also do things like make them look younger or make them age, which is now being done. It's expensive to do now, but it'll become basically cheap and easy for anybody to age or chronologically adjust the face. And if you can change the age, we can change other things. You could change their look. You can make them more handsome, more beautiful than they look in real life. And that look would sustain itself consistently throughout the entire narrative. And we can also stitch between. We can actually have a real actor and a virtual double and something in between, where maybe they said something or they did something in one area and we want to replicate that emotion on their face in another moment. We'll be able to do that. So that kind of fluidity that we have with, say, painting, where you can really modify anything you want make something in between, blur it, hybridize it, melt it, we'll be able to do with cinema, where cinema becomes almost like painting, where you are adding layers and layers of things. You start with a virtual set, and you often start with something very rough so you can kind of see where you're going, like you would do like a charcoal sketch underneath. And you add layers of more detail and layers of lighting on the top at the end. And so you construct a movie in the way you would paint it, by doing the outline, underlaying, and the shadows and the values, and just keep adding up and up until you end with the highlights. And that's how a lot of these high-budget movies will be made. They'll be painted, they'll be layered up in many ways, and all of it will be done digitally, even the stuff where you're working with real actors in a real set. And of course, the next step after that would be to take those digital characters and to animate them in some ways with AIs. Okay, so you can have virtual characters, you can have autonomous characters, you can have actors that are being either driven and animated in the way that a actor in a Pixar movie is animated. There's a human voice, but even that can be manipulated today and generated. So we'll have all degrees of synthesis in having characters where there's no real person behind them all the way. They may be partly behind them sometimes, maybe their voice, maybe part of their voice, maybe the directions, maybe some emotions, or maybe some combination of several actors all at once. So the idea is that we have a very malleable clay. And that clay is that we can make a virtual set and virtual characters. For a long time, the power of a really good human actor will be so much more economical. So you give them the assignment to act out, and they may do several takes and they'll do it. And that is so much easier than trying to have to create and guide and supervise one artificially. But where that becomes important is if you're an amateur filmmaker and you can't afford this great professional actor, or you're living somewhere far away where you don't have access to that, or you want that character to look something that's not like human or very different in some way, or you want them to look older or younger. So there's many reasons why we want to have a synthetic character where we simply couldn't get that real human actor. But we might want to use them as the engine underneath a virtual character. But there may be things that we want that character to do that either the human is not able to or cannot do. And there, again, we have the new tools that will allow us to do things that humans can't do by themselves. So even AI will migrate into filmmaking, and it'll be used in part to supply an intelligence to objects and things that we don't normally have intelligence. And those would be things like other unusual characters, extra characters that we can't afford to hire as humans. If we're making a crowd scene, we want individuality. Again, if we're a cheap amateur filmmaker, we don't have the resources, so we can have AI make characters for us. The other future that we see is, again, not in this blockbuster arena, but in the lower end where we're making lots and lots of videos, and everybody's making videos, everybody's making movies, everybody is a director. We're going to see, again, people using their phones more and more. Right now, you can take a high-end smartphone and you can actually film a movie on it. And the new ones that have various lenses that are different focal lengths is one example, but you can also buy extra lenses for a phone, and you can reproduce almost any look that you would imagine in a big blockbuster cinema with your phone. What you can't do yet very well is edit all that, and that's a big process, often done in a big bay, on a bigger screen with lots of buttons and stuff. But even that is coming along on phones. And again, AI will assist us in making those tools to do the post-productions on what we have captured, even on our phones. And this little screen on the phone is not the ideal place to do it, but it will be done. I think a better place to do the editing is going to be in VR and AR, in augmented reality in the mirror world. And that is the real kind of frontier in moving images, is when moving images move into the 3 dimensions. It's not just the stereo aspect where we can kind of see things with 3 dimensions. It's the fact that it's spatial. So the mirror world is a spatial world with volume and distance and presence, and where we can use gestures and our whole bodies, our full bodies, not just little fingertips typing on things or our thumbs. And there's a whole new gesture language that will have to be evolved to enable us to manipulate things, somewhat hinted at by the movie Minority Report, where you're conducting and moving data bits around. But we'll be able to start to edit moving images. And sometimes those moving images might just be 2D, but sometimes they may be 3D, like in the mirror world. But we'll be able to edit them, manipulate them, construct stories in that spatial realm. And that's a decade or two off, but that's sort of where we're headed. And it's a much better way than kind of trying to tap a little tiny glass screen. We'll have the full use of all our limbs. We can have analog equivalent dials, and we'll have the voice input. That's not to be forgotten, the fact that in this spatial world, it's also a spatially audible world. So there's voice interaction. And the combination of voice and gesture in a spatial thing will be, I think, the natural home for moving images. The moving images really want to be spatial. And again, I'm not talking about stereo 3D, which is very limited in its appeal, but spatially it's a whole different thing. You can see my talk on the mirror world as an example of that, but I think that's the natural home of the moving image and where the newest tools will be used. And I think we'll come to those pretty soon, where we'll try to start to Engenic means to use the tools of the medium are inside the medium itself. And so this idea that you're going to create the AR world inside AR, that you're going to manufacture and manipulate AR images inside of AR itself. Right now, a lot of the games of the world are made on 2D screens. So there's people not in the world, there are people outside the world making those game worlds, but you really want to make the game world inside the same space that the game world happens in. That's Engenic. So that's there's the move to different durations, there's the move to virtual sets and virtual characters, and there's a move to this world of AR and gestures and voice. And the last general pioneer movement, I think, is going to be to the ever-present moving images. Again, that TikTok and YouTube are an example of where most of our experience every day with moving images are not coming from Hollywood or Bollywood or the Chinese minister of movies. It's going to become from the bottom, from people making little tiny clips, maybe longer ones, that are moving images that will be telling a story, and that it'll become very easy for everybody to make. So there'll be thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of different entities making stories for us this way, using the tools. And we'll watch them on the small screen, we'll watch them with our headsets, we'll watch them all different places. But what we're going to see is that will be the bottom of the pyramid of the moving images. At the top, a few little charismatic Hollywood movies. Maybe there's only maybe there's less than 1,000 of those made a year. And at the bottom, billions and billions of TikTok, Facebook stories, Instagram stories. Just people making movies by the billions at the bottom. That's where the real power is. That's where the real creativity will happen and the real innovation. And I think 30 years from now, when people talk about movies, they'll think about that stuff at the bottom rather than those shoes, charismatic ones at the top. And that's, I think, where we want to look to see where the new innovations are happening, because they're going to happen there first. So that's where I think we're headed in the next 20 years with moving images.